Amen. Okay, so greetings again. We will pick up from where we left off. We've been talking about the history of the religious right and the anti-choice movement. And we've spoken about how the architects of the religious right people like Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell they formed an alliance with leaders of the anti-choice movement. People like John C. Wilk, who we identified as the father of anti-choice misinformation. If you look at the history, what you will see is a mushrooming of organizations. On the right, you have organizations like the Heritage Foundation. The Federalist Society that we had discussed in our last study. And what you see on the side of the anti-choice movement is a mushrooming of organizations as well. Right, and in this study that we're doing, in these 4 sessions in which I've covered the history, we really haven't had the time to unpack some of that history and to look at some of these organizations. These are some of the gaps you'll have to fill through your own research or by reading the book. And there's more about them in my notes, which I will share. But we saw that the architects of the religious right and the leaders of the anti-choice movement we saw that they had settled upon a 3-part strategy. The first part was to take the Supreme Court. The second one was to promote legislation in state governments. That would undermine or make hollow the provisions of Roe versus Wade. And the third part was to use propaganda and misinformation to try to shift public opinion and gain as much political influence as possible. And the Federalist Society lined up with the first part of this three-part strategy. We saw that we discussed the purpose of the Federalist Society, that it was constructed on the philosophy of constitutional originalism. Constitutional originalism. And this is the idea that the Constitution should be interpreted the way the founders understood it. Which, as we discussed, if you really think about it, there's serious problems with that. Because the worldview of the average person who cares about their neighbor is very different from that of the founders. Or I should say there are significant differences. And the Federalist Society, it was built for the purpose of influencing legal minds in law school. Influencing them in a conservative direction. And then channeling these graduates into influential jobs. And eventually putting in place conservative Supreme Court justices. And within the Federalist Society itself, opposition to abortion became a litmus test, a standard position. And what was seen was that those who tended to be anti-choice also tended to adhere to the broader philosophy and political preferences of the religious right. And we're at a point today in 2021 where there's a supermajority of Federalist Society judges on the Supreme Court. Six of the 9 Supreme Court justices have Federalist Society connections. There are useful documentaries on YouTube now about the Federalist Society. And how it has grown to be the most powerful and influential legal organization in the United States. And we're going to talk more about those judges, because we must look at them. If you remember, the strategy of the radical right is they need the Supreme Court. They need the Supreme Court because they know that public opinion is not on their side. And the Supreme Court is not answerable to voters. So for a group of people who know their positions are unpopular, but who want to impose their positions on the rest of society, taking the Supreme Court is a crucial step in that process. I want to move on to another victory of the religious right and the anti-choice movement. And we'll come back to our chart, which I've updated. And I will be sharing this updated version. Over here, you see 1996 DNX legislation introduced. DNX stands for Dilation and Extraction. Okay, so again, going to give some information. A common abortion procedure is referred to as dilation and evacuation. So I'm going to give some graphic descriptions now. Dilation and evacuation is a process where the fetus is dismembered in the womb. So it can be removed in parts without damaging the pregnant woman's cervix. And this is done to preserve the woman's ability to have children in the future. So that's dilation and evacuation. Now, dilation and extraction is a process that was initially presented in 1995. A process for conducting abortions later in the pregnancy. Like from 20 weeks or so onwards. But also, so before the, later in the pregnancy, but before the point of fetal viability. I'm just trying to, sorry, I'm just struggling to find the simplest way to express some of these concepts. So with dilation and extraction, it's a process where the woman's cervix is dilated and the fetus is removed whole. Feet first, with only the skull being broken at the end to allow it to pass through the vaginal canal. Now, of all abortions taking place, dilation and extraction abortions only make up a small minority. If we look at some statistics, in the year 2000, over 1.3 million abortions were recorded in the United States. And about 0.2% of them were dilation and extraction abortions. Right? 0.2%. Not only do dilation and extraction abortions represent such a small number, of the abortions that are happening, a lot of dilation and extraction abortions happen in wanted pregnancies. Pregnancies that are wanted, but something would have gone wrong. Right? Such as severe fetal abnormalities that only appear later in the pregnancy. But anti-choice activists, they saw an opportunity in the development of this process, and they framed propaganda, right, which painted graphic pictures of this process. And they coined a term, partial birth abortion. I'll just put some of these things over here. They put the label partial birth abortion on dilation and extraction abortions. Because they wanted to paint the picture that these are abortions taking place in the 9th month. These are abortions taking place on healthy fetuses in the 9th month. which was just patently false. And they, they use that misinformation to generate as much outrage as possible. They framed this they put together this misinformation, and working with the organization Americans United for Life, they began to introduce legislation banning what they called partial birth abortions. They didn't care how few people were seeking this procedure. They didn't care that when this process happened, it usually happened in wanted pregnancies that had gone wrong. They ignored the stories of the suffering of the women who had to undergo this process. And they ignored the data, which showed that even with these dilation and extraction abortions, most of them were taking place before the fetus was viable. And they ignored the fact that the termination of pregnancies in the 9th month was virtually non-existent. So what they were doing is they were engaged in political theater. It had little to do with health. Right? They were coming off losses to Bill Clinton. And they needed to show movement on an issue that would activate their base. And when the Democrats were confronted by this legislation, the description is that they were caught off guard. They were caught by surprise. They were caught unprepared. They did not know how to effectively respond to what they knew and to what they knew the Republicans knew were blatant lies. And she goes on to talk in this book about how the Republicans calculated that they had painted a picture so ugly and so graphic that the Democrats would be reluctant to defend abortion in that case. And they were right. So I'm looking for the state. It says both state and federal bills banning partial birth abortion passed with even Democrats switching sides to support it. So the federal version of the bill came to Bill Clinton in 1996. And in 1990, and he vetoed it. Yes. And it came before him again in 1997. He vetoed it again. And fast forward in time, there was a little progress on that issue. It basically stopped. And when George Bush took office in 2001, the radical right saw an opportunity to gain a victory against abortion. So they sent a partial abortion bill was sent to George Bush in 2003. And Bush passed it. Wait, let me see. Bush signed it without hesitation. So, what does this battle over dilation and extraction, what did it prove? Right? The radical right saw that their movement had hit its stride. They proved that a well-crafted message grounded in disinformation has the power to triumph over the facts and over good policy. They saw that through disinformation, they could own the narrative, they could own the story. And put their political opponents in a permanent position of, at a constant disadvantage. And they saw that the network of organizations that they had established to influence politics in Washington, as well as to move the courts in a conservative direction. They saw that this network of organizations had become so effective that they could win on their priorities, even when public opinion was not on their side. And to speak about the Democrats in this situation, the challenge that the Democrats have faced other than their constantly compromising in the face of an opponent who is decided, apart from that, the Democrats have had a messaging disadvantage. The Democrat strategies have relied heavily on data and facts. Whereas the Republicans have been able to develop messaging that appeals to people's emotions. You can connect this to the nature of man, where there's the issue of fast brain versus slow brain. The fast brain tends to win out. And you can see this messaging advantage that the Republicans have on other issues as well. Like on taxes, for example. They say, it's your money, you should get to keep it. Therefore, they don't want they don't want to pay taxes. You know, that's very simple. At face value, it makes sense. But the left is not saying the opposite. They're not saying you shouldn't get to keep your money. So you see just how the Republicans have framed the issue. You know, the Democrats are already on the defensive. And when you hear the left's or the Democrats' perspective on the issue, they say, well, you know, we need to find the balance of what is fair. And that will still allow us to properly fund the government. You know, and so on and so on. You see, it's more involved, right? You see this messaging advantage, you know, that the right has taken advantage of again and again. And I think you see the parallels within the movement. In how we are moving away from simplistic reasoning and learning to embrace the complexity of reality. The complexity of the truth. Okay, so I'm going to move on. The next development, or the next person I want to talk about, in this progression of history, is a woman by the name Kellyanne Conway. Kellyanne Conway. Most of you may remember Kellyanne Conway as Trump's senior advisor. She did a lot of speaking on behalf of the Trump administration. And if you're like me, you may feel she, at the time, that she came out of nowhere. That she appeared rather suddenly on the political stage during the Trump campaign. But her role in advancing the Republican Party's political power and her role in advancing their anti-woman agenda it goes much further back. So a bit of background on her. Kellyanne Conway was a young law student when she first developed an interest in politics. She was a research assistant for a firm that worked on political strategy for Ronald Reagan. And that was when she was a student. And after graduating, she committed herself to politics. And she joined the Frank Luntz firm. I'll write it down. So she joined the Frank Luntz firm after graduating. And she worked for this firm in the 1990s. Now, what this firm specialized in doing was in using language to manipulate emotions. And the firm began to take on political clients. Particularly from the Republican Party. So Newt Gingrich Yes, Newt Gingrich, you remember he's a Republican politician. And he's run for the Republican candidacy a number of times. In 1994, Gingrich developed a campaign called the Contract with America. And the campaign, the contract with America was the center of the Republican Party's effort to regain power after the election of Clinton. And for it to succeed, it needed women's support. And Kellyanne Conway worked on this project as a strategist, helping them work out how they could win women. Newt Gingrich was so impressed by her work that he helped her set up her own company. It's a company called the Polling Company. Right. The polling company took on many corporate clients. Such as Vaseline and American Express. And she worked on helping them better understand women. Women's attitudes and trends. With the goal of expanding their customer base. But she began to translate her understanding of political strategies or rather, I should say that, let me say it this way. She began to translate her understanding into political strategies for her growing base of Republican Party clients. And in the book, it talks about how she struck the perfect balance between reverence for the white men who ran the Republican Party and gentle reinforcement of the messaging that they needed to win women voters. You know, there is a New York Magazine article which comments about how she made a specialty of teaching wild men how to be less threatening to women. And in the book, The Lie That Binds, it frames it differently. It talks about how she worked with men who very easily and impulsively spoke about their sexism and their belief in an order which placed white men in a position of dominance. Working with them so they didn't say those offensive parts out loud. She not only became the strategist for a growing base of Republican politicians, she became sought after by anti-choice organizations. Of which she personally held an anti-choice position herself. So from that perspective, she was not troubled by the morality of what she was doing. At least that's how it's framed in the book. So what was her strategy? Because her strategy is quite prominent in the victories that we see following for the radical right and the anti-choice movement. Her strategy involved manipulating statistical data to make unpopular positions seem more popular than they really were. In this case, specifically anti-choice positions. And then her strategy was to boldly rebrand the Republican Party as pro-women. Right? So against facts and against history, just rebrand and say this is what we are. Right? And when challenged, when that position is challenged by Democrats who would say, but no, you are anti-woman, you are anti-abortion. Accuse the Democrats of being extreme in their positions and accuse them of being obsessed with abortion. Right? Accuse them of being extreme and accuse them of being obsessed with abortion. But who are the ones who are obsessed with abortion? It was the Republicans. There's a term for that. It's called gaslighting. I don't know if there's an equivalent in the other languages. Right? It's a form of psychological abuse where a person leads you to question your reality. And they accuse you of doing what they are doing. to confuse you and to disorient you. Right. So where we see the Kellyanne Conway strategy in effect is with the Affordable Care Act. I'll write that down, the Affordable Care Act. Popularly known as Obamacare. The Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010. And it was Obama's signature piece of legislation. And its purpose was to bring, was to put in place a system of, was to bring public health care to the United States. For example, here in Canada, as it is, in many industrialized countries, healthcare is a public good. It's a tax-funded public good. Right? So you go to hospital, you receive treatment, and you can be seen by a doctor without paying, without being charged. Most industrialized countries have some level of a public healthcare system. I know many European countries have that. But America hasn't had that. And if you want to understand the reason why, you have to look at the work of the Republican Party. Organizations like the Heritage Foundation, and the architects of the radical right. There's an entire history there on that subject. But for many people, it's a stunning thing that as wealthy a country as it is, they don't have public health. There's talk about how many people are one serious illness away from bankruptcy. But in any case, many people, there wasn't really a public health care, or rather, that's what Obamacare was meant to put in place. But the problem is that Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, it started from a position of compromise. because rather than seeking to expand healthcare, by funding it through the government, they sought to expand healthcare through a corporate-driven model. That was actually made popular by Mitt Romney, a Republican. And by Mitt Romney and promoted by the Heritage Foundation. And they started from this position of compromise. To try to find common ground with the Republicans. But the Republicans, again, were ready to move the goalposts. There's an expression in English where they say, you know, I gave you my hand and you took my arm. Right? That's what you see again and again in the relationship between these two parties. But did the Republicans accept the compromise? No, they did not. Well, firstly, what was the Democrat compromise? It wasn't simply to pass healthcare through a market system, through a corporate system. Right? The Democrats believed that they could win over the Republicans if they were flexible on some key issues. And what key issue do you think they decided to be flexible on? Abortion. Right? So they decided that they weren't going to push for abortion to be covered by the Affordable Care Act. But the GOP rejected this. And they continued to push the claim that the Affordable Care Act was a backdoor way to fund abortions. And they targeted vulnerable Democrats with this misinformation. Right? Democrats in really closely contested, from really closely contested constituencies. They did that, and they also introduced a bill to modify the Affordable Care Act. This bill was the Stupak-Pitts bill. I'll write down. It was the Stupak-Pitts bill. And to put it simply, what this bill would have done is that it would have increased the scope of people that would be denied access to abortions. Putting it simply, some of this, it's quite technical, and we have limited time. So some of these things I'm putting there in a really basic fashion, trusting you to go back and look into it yourself. But this bill was seen as a win-win by the conservatives. Because if it passed, it would have struck another blow against the provision of abortion. And if the Democrats didn't pass it, the Republicans could then accuse the Democrats of being obsessed with abortion. And then, causing the Affordable Care Act to fail because of their obsession with abortion. So if you see that is out of Kellyanne Conway's playbook. Right. This bill was only withdrawn when Obama passed an executive order barring any funding issued under the Affordable Care Act from funding abortion. Right. So you see this again and again. Democrat compromise and Republicans shifting the goalposts. But Obama's executive order did not satisfy the Republicans. Or the radical right. They continued to frame conspiracy theories about the Affordable Care Act. That it was a secret means of funding abortion. And there was all this talk of, you may remember it from years ago, that the Affordable Care Act would lead to the setting up of death panels. Yes. That the Affordable Care Act would lead to the setting up of committees who would decide who gets to live or die. Right. I remember that in the news, particularly, on conservative speakers and conservative commentators. They were really pushing that idea. So we see that the GOP and the anti-choice movement, they were attempting to walk this tightrope. Where they were expressing concern for women and women's freedoms on one hand, while forwarding efforts to undermine women's freedom on the other. Right? They're saying one thing but doing another thing. Now, okay, so we have a bit of time. I'm going to skip over a few things so we can reach the end. Okay, a major step towards advancing women's equality is the development of contraception. There is a document which reviews more than 66 studies. This is in the notes. The document has a long title, but it was a review of 66 studies conducted over 30 years. And has shown that access to contraception and the avoidance of unplanned pregnancies lead to increases in young women obtaining a level of college education. Increases in college educated women pursuing advanced professional degrees. Increases in participation in the workforce by women. Increases in women's earning power and decreases in the gender pay gap. And it's in the area of contraception that we see the Republican Party making its next attacks. Against the Affordable Care Act. And we see this in the next court case that we will talk about. Which we see on our chart as Burwell versus Hobby Lobby. That 2014 case of Burwell versus Hobby Lobby. So the Affordable Care Act it proposed a long overdue reform that birth control be covered at no extra cost to the employee. But the owners of the business Hobby Lobby they sought to deny their employees this coverage. Using religious liberty as their defense. Their argument was that certain forms of contraception were what they called abortifacients. I don't know if there's the word in that for another language, but basically certain forms of contraception were basically certain forms of contraception induced abortion. Right? Because a contraception is meant to prevent conception. But they argued that certain forms of contraception were ending the pregnancy after conception had taken place. So rather than preventing conception, they were agents of abortion. So they argued that they shouldn't be required to offer this to their employees. So in a really contentious decision, the Supreme Court ruled for Hobby Lobby. And in the book, the point is, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg was on that court. And she expressed the dangers that she feared would come out of this decision. You know, that what is the implication if we allow businesses to deny employees' rights on the basis of religious liberty? She feared it would be the beginning of, it would open the door to other rights being denied. To a group of people because of another person's religious liberty. Right? This idea of religious liberty is problematic because the idea of religious liberty is freedom to practice what you believe. Not to impose what you believe upon someone else. So, you know, what she was concerned about was this weaponization of religious liberty. That, you know, that it would be the tip of the spear. and opened the door to other things. And what's interesting about this Hobby Lobby case was the opinion by the conservative justices that the fact that these methods of contraception were not agents of abortion. In fact, the fact that the fact that the Hobby Lobby's characterization of these contraceptive methods was incorrect. That fact did not matter. As long as they sincerely believed it to be so. If I read the text, it says the court's majority wrote the fact that birth control did not actually cause abortions was irrelevant. For a violation of religious liberty to occur, the plaintiff must only believe it could happen. Right? That has interesting implications. If you reason that out, 4 of the 5 justices that ruled in that case had connections to the Federalist Society. Okay, so we are now approaching the end of our time. And the final section I want to cover is the Trump administration. There's a lot that can be said about the Trump administration. And all the things that happened, all the things that happened in that administration. But for our purposes, I'd just like to highlight one development, or rather, one development. Which is the appointments that Trump made to the Supreme Court. Right, we see that in 2017, Trump nominated Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court. In 2018, he nominated Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. And last year, he nominated Amy Coney Barrett to that court as well. And now what you have for the first time is a situation where you have 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices as having come through the Federalist Society. I think I'll close on that point. And we'll elaborate on that at the beginning of our final study tomorrow. Before we start looking at the second book, the Turnaway Study. Okay, so I'll close here. I'll ask that we kneel for a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for the ground that we've been able to cover. Lord, it's a lot of information, but I pray that through it a clear picture may be painted. That will inform our perspectives in the present. Please keep us until we meet again tomorrow. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, everyone, thank you for your time. Pray you have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. And a special thank you to the translators for all your hard work. God bless.